Radha Gokulananda ki jai, Sitaram Lakshman Hanuman ki jai, Shishi Gauranitai ki jai. So Hare Krishna everyone. We'll be singing this Gora Arti. It's sung every day at this time, 7 p.m. So if you need to follow along the words, they're just here in the top right hand corner. Jaya Jaya Gaura Chande Aratika Shobha Jaya Jaya Gaura Chande Aratika Shobha Jana Vitatavane Jagamana Loba Jana Vitatavane Jagamana Loba Dake Nenita Bhamegadhara Tanke Nenithai-chan Bhamegadhara Nikate Advaita Srini Vasa Chatradara Nikate Advaita Srini Vasa Chatradara Bose Ache Gorachan Ratna Simhasane Bose Ache Gorachan Ratna Simhasane Arati Kore na Brahma Adi Devagane Arati Kore na Brahma Adi Devagane Nara Hari Adi Kore Chamaradulaya Narahari Adi Kori Chamaradulaya Sanjaya Mukunda Vasu Gosadijaya Jaya Mukunda Vasu Gosadijaya Shankha Bhaji Gantha Bhaji Bhaji Karatala Shankha Bhaji Gantha Bhaji Bhaji Karatala Madhura Mridanga Bhaji Paramarasala Madhura Mridanga Bhaji Paramarasala Bahukati Chandrajini Varana Ujvala Bahukati Chandrajini Varana Ujvala Kala deshe banamala kore jalamala gala deshe banamala kore jalamala Shiva Sukha Narada Preme Gada Gada Preme Gada Gada Bhaktivinoda Tagore Gaura Rasampada Bhaktivinoda Tagore Gaura Rasampada Jaya Gauranitai Jaya Gauranitai Jaya Gauranitai Jaya Gauranitai Jaya Gauranitai 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 Jaya Gauranitai Gaura Haribo 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 Gaura Haribo Gaura Haribo 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 Nitai Gaura Haribo Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama. Yes, sure. Hare Hare. No problem. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama Rama, Govinda Jaya Jaya, Gopala Jaya Jaya, Govinda Jaya Jaya, Gopala Jaya Jaya, Radha Ramana Hari, Govinda Jaya Jaya, Radha Ramana Hari, Govinda Jaya Jaya, Govinda Jaya Jaya, Gopala Jaya Jaya, Govinda Jaya Jaya, Gopala Jaya Jaya, Radha Ramana Hari, Govinda Jaya Jaya, Radha Ramana Hari, Govinda Jaya Jaya, Shri Ram Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, 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 Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama Ram Rama Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama Ram Rama Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama Ram Rama Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama Ram Rama Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Rama Hare Rama Rama. Everyone please, everyone together. Hare Krishna everyone. Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare. Again, everyone please, everyone. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama Rama Rama. Again, everyone please, everybody. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama Rama Rama. One last time, everyone please, one more time. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare. Everyone. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Oh, Krishna, Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Govinda Jaya Jaya Gopala Jaya Jaya, 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 Radha Ramana Hari Govinda 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 Jaya Jaya, Govinda Jaya Jaya Gopala 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 Jaya Jaya, Radha Ramana Hari Govinda Jaya Jaya, Radha Ramana Hari Govinda Jaya Jaya, Shri Radhe, Radha Gokula Nanda, Radha Gokula Nanda, Radha Gokula Nanda Shri. Jaya Sita Ram Lakshman Hanuman, Jaya Sita Ram Lakshman Hanuman, Jaya Sita Ram Hanuman, Jaya Gauranitai, Jaya Gauranitai, Jaya Gauranitai, Jaya Gauranitai, Gauranitai, Gauranitai. Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Srila Prabhupada, 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 Srila Prabhupada. Shri Radha Gokulananda Ki Jai, Sitaram Lakshman Hanuman Ki Jai, Shri Gauranitai Bhagavan Ki Jai, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai, Nitai Gaura Premanande Hari Hari Bo. You want to sing the Shinigate first? Yeah? You want to sing the Shinigate first?
If you want me, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll play. You can play with that.
I don't know, I can play this. Yeah. Namaste Narushingaya. Lada lada daine. Jana kashi purvakshaha. Shiladan kalae. Ito na singo padato na singo. Jato yato yamito to no shingo. Pae na shingo ido e no shingo. Na shingo modim sharanam tropati. Tavo kari kamala hore na ko. Tanuinga Keshavadita Arhari Rupa Jagadishare Jai Jagadishare Jai Jagadishare Pavanavare Navadita Singha Nalita Hiranavasigo Tanuinga Keshavadita Arhari Rupa Jagadishare Jai Jagadishare Jai Jagadishare Jai Narasimhadev Narasimhadev Simhadev Jai Narasimhadev Simhadev Jai Simhadev Jai Narasimhadev Jai Prahlad Maharaj Prahlad Maharaj Prahlad Maharaj Jai Prahlad Maharaj भगवान की प्रहलाद महाराज की प्रभुपाद की चंडीदास गौर मानंदे थैंक यू जी और yes is your playing
Thank you so much. Save the your time.
so nice
I'll keep it. Give it. Yeah, give it back to you. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Poetry. Just recite some nice poetry. I'm gonna get that session going. Who is this Alabama?
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. I think yes. Just there we go. Hare Krishna. 8:11. 8:11. Yes. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Govinda Vallabha Girivaradhari Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Prajajana Ranjana Yamuna Tira Panajari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Hare Jaya Radha Gokula Nanda Radha Gokula Nanda Radha Gokula Nanda Shri Radhe Jaya Radha Gokula Nanda Radha Gokula Nanda Radha Gokula Nanda Shri Radhe Jaya Sita Ram Lakshman Hanuman 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 Jaya Gauranitai 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 Jaya Gauranitai Jaya Gauranitai 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 Jaya Gauranitai Jaya Jaya Prabhupada 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 Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada 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 Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Jayam Vishnupad Paramahamsa Privajkacharya Ashtotra Shata Shri Srimad Sesi Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Jai Anant Koti Vaishnav Vrinda Ki Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Prem Se Kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Ki Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gop Gopinath Sham Kund Radha Kund Giri Govardhan ki, Shri Naputavip Mai Pudham ki, Shri Mathura Vrindavan Dham ki, Ganga Mai ki jai, Yamuna Mai ki jai, Bhakti Devi ki, Tulsi Devi ki, Shri Harinam Sankirtan ki, Samveta Bhakta Vrinda ki, Gaura Premananda Haribo. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Gauranga. Okay. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Hare Krishna, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. So I'm asking for your blessings so I can do justice on this wonderful verse for my own purification and, of course, my own understanding. So the class today is on the 11th verse from the 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Yadaksharam veda vido vidanti vishanti yadyatayo vita ragaha yadichanto brahmacharyam charanti tatte padam sangrahanena prabhakshye. So please repeat after me. Yadaksharam veda vido vidanti
Yadaksharam veda vido vidanti
vishanti yadyatayo vitaragaha
Vishanti yadyatayo vitaragaha
yadichanto brahmacharyam charanti
Yadichanto brahmacharyam charanti
tatte padam sangrahena prabhakshye.
Tate padam sangrahane prabhakshe.
I'm now going to do the word-for-word translation. Please repeat after me. Yat,
Yat,
that which.
that which.
Aksharam,
Aksharam,
syllable.
syllable.
Syllable om.
Syllable om.
Veda vidaha,
Veda vidaha.
persons conversant with the Vedas.
Persons conversing with the Vedas.
Vedanti,
Vedanti.
say.
Say.
Vishanti,
Vishanti.
enter.
Enter.
Yat,
Yat.
in which.
In which.
Yataya,
Yataya.
great sages.
Great sages.
Vitaragaha,
Vitaragaha.
in the renounced order of life.
In the renounced order of life.
Yat,
Yat.
that which.
That which.
Vichantaha,
Vijantaha.
desiring.
Desiring.
Brahmacharyam,
Brahmacharya.
celibacy.
Celibacy.
Charanti,
Charanti.
practice.
Practice.
That, that.
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 Te,
Say.
unto you.
Unto you.
Padam,
Padam.
situation.
Situation.
Sangrahena,
Sangrahena.
in summary.
In summary.
Pravakshesh,
Pravakshe.
I shall explain.
I shall explain.
So translation by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada ki.
Jai.
Persons who are learned in the Vedas, who utter Omkara, and who are great sages in the renounced order, enter into Brahman. Desiring such perfection, one practices celibacy. I shall now briefly explain to you this process by which one may attain salvation. So please repeat after me. Persons who are learned in the Vedas,
Persons who learn it in Vedas,
who utter Omkara,
who utter Omkar,
and who are great sages in the renounced order,
and who are great sages in the renounced order,
enter into Brahman.
enter into Brahman.
Desiring such perfection,
Desiring such perfection,
one practices celibacy.
one practices celibacy.
I shall now briefly explain to you
I shall now briefly explain to you
this process by which
this process by which
one may attain salvation.
one may attain salvation.
I'm now going to read the purport by His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada. Lord Sri Krishna has recommended to Arjuna the practice of Satchakra Yoga, in which one places the air of life between the eyebrows. Taking it for granted that Arjuna might not know how to practice Satchakra Yoga, the Lord explains the process in the following verses. The Lord says that Brahman, although one without a second, has various manifestations and features. Especially for the impersonalist, the Akshara or Omkara, the syllable Om, is identical with Brahman. Krishna here explains the impersonal Brahman, into which the renounced order of sages enter. In the Vedic system of knowledge, students, from the very beginning, are taught to vibrate Om and learn of the ultimate impersonal Brahman by living with the spiritual master in complete celibacy. In this way, they realize two of Brahman's features. This practice is very essential for the student's advancement in spiritual life. But at the moment, such brahmachari, or unmarried celibate life, is not at all possible. The social construction of the world has changed so much that there is no possibility of one's practicing celibacy from the beginning of student life. Throughout the world, there are many institutions for different departments of knowledge, but there is no recognized institution where students can be educated in the brahmachari principles. Unless one practices celibacy, advancement in spiritual life is very difficult. Therefore, Lord Chaitanya has announced, according to the scriptural injunctions for this age of Kali, that in this age, no process of realizing the Supreme is possible, except the chanting of the holy names of Lord Krishna. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. So, in this verse, Lord Krishna has recommended to Arjun the process of Satchakra Yoga. Actually, let me just start the prayers. Om Jnana Timurandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Jakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Svayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Svapadantikam Pandeham Shri Guru Shri Utha Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrayatam Sahagana Raghunatanvitam Tam Sajivan Sadvaitam Sapadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinu Bandhu Jagatpate Gopisha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radha Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Panchakalpa Churubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavnebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram 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 Hare Hare. Okay, please do stay for class if you'd like to. Yes. Okay. So today we're talking about the 11th verse of the 8th chapter. And the 8th chapter is called Attaining the Supreme. And in this chapter, up until the 7th verse, Krishna has already spoken about how at the time of death our spirituality is tested. So in verse 6, he says, whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, O son of Kunti, that state he will attain without fail. So he's relating to Arjun, basically that we should remember Krishna all the time. And then at the time of death, if we think of him, then we will attain his nature, we'll attain that state and go back to Godhead. But if you don't die in the proper mind, this is the question that arises. If you don't die in the proper mind, in the state of mind that is conducive to going back to Godhead, what happens? Well, from this verse, it's clear that whatever you think about when you leave the body, then that state you will attain in your next lifetime. So, that's what your soul is going to be drawn towards. And Prabhupada cites the example of Bharat Maharaj, who's a great king, and he renounced his family and his kingdom and went to the forest to attain self-realization. But then he happened to become attached to a baby deer who had lost its mother and whose life he had saved. And he became so preoccupied with the deer, constantly worrying about its well-being. So at the end of his life, because he'd spent his whole life thinking about the deer, that was what his mind dwelt on when it came to him leaving his body. And the deer was the last thing on his mind. And so in his next life, he gained the body of a deer. And he veered away from transcendental pursuits, which is, unfortunately, what kind of accepting an animal body would lead to. And in the 7th verse itself, Krishna has told us that we need to think about him all the time. Sarveshu kaleshu, you should always think of me, because, the truth is actually, we don't know when we're going to leave our bodies. We may pass away at any time. We think, well, we have 80 years or 90 years or 100 years, but, that might not necessarily be the case. And to attain the best destination in our next lifetime, to make sure that we don't, appear in the body of a deer or any other animal, and to attain the best destination, which is Krishna Loka, we need to look at yoga practices. And there's one yoga practice that Krishna is telling us about in this verse 11, and in the following verses after that. But before we talk about what these yoga practices are, I'm going to jump back briefly to the preceding 2 chapters to give some context. So the chapter before this one, the 7th chapter, is called Knowledge of the Absolute. And in that chapter, Krishna basically talks about Bhakti Yoga and how we should surrender to him. And he states that we should surrender to him and not the demigods. And he mentioned in the 7th chapter that men of small intelligence worship the demigods. And demigod worship isn't recommended in the practice of Krishna consciousness, because, the boons that the demigods grant can only ever be temporary. For example, you might pray to Saraswati Devi for good exam results, or Uma Devi for a good husband or wife. And the desires may be granted, but they'll only come to us in a limited way. At the end of our lifetime, the results will just vanish. And this method actually makes us attached to worship for our own personal gain, for materialistic purposes. And it doesn't engender in us an attitude of selfless service. And Krishna says that the demigods are actually different parts of the universal body of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So it's actually Krishna himself who empowers the demigods to fulfill the desires of the living entities. And so they can't act independently. So in the 7th chapter, Krishna is inviting us to surrender to him and get permanent results rather than temporary ones. And in fact, the topmost results through the medium of devotional service leads us to establish our eternal relationship with Krishna. And in verse 18, in the 7th chapter, he says to Arjuna, "He who is situated in knowledge of me, I consider to be just like my own self. Being engaged in my transcendental service, he is sure to attain me, the highest and most perfect goal." So if you have no other desires apart from Krishna, you actually become dearer to Krishna than his own self. And it's just like the example of the gopis, and they were dearer to him than he was himself. And so that is the ultimate objective of our lives, the highest platform. So that's all explained in the 7th chapter, surrendering to Krishna. And I'm going to go back to the chapter before that as well, the 6th chapter, because Krishna there talks about Ashtanga Yoga. So in the 7th chapter it's Bhakti, and in the 6th chapter it's Ashtanga Yoga. And he describes the process of Ashtanga Yoga. And in verses 11 to 14, for example, he describes how we can control the mind, that we should go to the forest, sit on some kusha grass, wear deer skin, and hold one's body, neck and head in a straight, erect line, and stare at the tip of the nose and meditate completely on Krishna. And this is a process which takes 8 stages to complete. And once the mind is controlled using this method, it's only then that the living entity can connect with the supersoul in the heart. So it's kind of a mechanical process for controlling the mind, whereas if we practice Bhakti Yoga from the outset, then we don't need to practice a separate process because our mind is automatically controlled in the service of Krishna. If we think about Krishna constantly and make our every action an offering to him in unmitigated service, then our mind is resting on where it should be, on the Supreme. But in the Ashtanga Yoga process described in chapter 6, it takes a long time to get to the stage. And, you have to go through the eightfold system. So you have to go through yam, which is the controlling of the senses initially, and niyam, strict following of the rules and regulations, a lot of rules and regulations in this process, asana, practice of the different sitting postures, and then pranayama, that's controlling the breathing, and pratyahara, withdrawing the senses from any sense objects, and dharana, concentration of the mind, dhyana, which is meditation, and then the stage of samadhi, or self-realization. So bhakti only starts in that process when you come to the point of samadhi, which is, the final stage. And Krishna says in verses 20 to 23 in the 6th chapter that the stage of perfection you reach from this method is called trance or samadhi, and in this state the mind is completely restrained from material mental activities, so it's completely under control. And this brings about a state of joy. And Prabhupada describes this Chitti Shakti, or transcendental joy, is easily achieved through execution of devotional service rather than having to go through the eightfold Ashtanga Yoga process. So I've just briefly covered the 6th chapter, in which Krishna discusses Ashtanga Yoga, and the 7th chapter, in which he covers bhakti. So this leads us now on to the 8th chapter, where Krishna is saying that you have to remember me all the time in order to get back to the spiritual world. And from the 8th verse onwards, Krishna is telling us you have to engage your mind in constantly remembering me up until the time of death. But how is it possible to constantly remember him? Do you have any ideas? How to constantly remember Krishna?
Filling your mind as much as you can with Krishna, always hearing something.
Brilliant, yeah. So you're talking about hearing something and filling your mind with Krishna as much as possible. That is a brilliant way. So you're talking about Shravanam, one of the first process of devotional service. So that's a really good answer. But it's no good just hearing him or even chanting his names, Shravanam, Kirtanam, or Vishnu Smaranam, when you get to your deathbed. So you have to practice for your entire life, in fact, from as early as you can make it. Because unless you've been practicing for a long time, for your whole life practically, then it's not possible to suddenly remember Krishna at the time of death. So in this way, you have to apply a system of yoga, either Ashtanga Yoga or Bhakti Yoga. But without practicing a system of yoga, it's not possible for us to remember Krishna at the time of our deaths and attain the supreme destination. Because, when we're sort of on our deathbeds, our minds are very disturbed, and it's not easy to focus. It's not easy to focus on the supreme goal unless you have the bona fide systematic practice of an authorized system. So in the verse we're looking at today, the 11th verse, Krishna is once again talking about the Ashtanga Yoga system, as he did in the 6th chapter, as a means of remembering him. So Krishna is covering this for the people who are interested in this method of attainment. However, this method is not a cheap method, it's not an easy one. It's very serious practice, and as we said, it takes a long time to achieve the outcome through the eightfold system. And you can't do it while living in a city and eating and drinking whatever you want and without practicing celibacy. So there are strict protocols and rules and regulations to follow, and as we mentioned in the Gita, it's recommended that you actually go to the forest. You go where there are no, where it's the mode of goodness rather than the mode of passion, and where there are no distractions. And then you can sit on your seat of kusha grass and wear your deer skin, and that's when you practice your strict control of the senses. So it's very, very far removed from the Hatha Yoga classes that we normally think of when we think of this type of yoga. And, Hatha Yoga, we might go to those classes, and we practice it mainly for health reasons, for exercising the body. But the Ashtanga, the genuine Ashtanga Yoga method, is carried out to connect with Krishna. So, when we carry out this type of yoga, and yoga actually means union, connection with the divine. So it's not just practicing good health. So in the previous verse, verse 10, Krishna says that, by practice of prana, or the breath, one can raise his life force, and it involves raising the life air through the 6 chakras of the body up to the forehead and to the area between the eyebrows. And this helps the mind to be fixed on the Supreme Personality of Godhead at the time of death. But actually, Prabhupada states for devotees, we don't need to practice this form of yoga because devotees are already engaged in Bhakti Yoga. But in this set of verses, this is the yoga process being espoused for those who want to use this method, who perhaps are not ready for Bhakti. And so in the 11th verse, it describes who's eligible to enter into Brahman. So these people, they have to be free from attachment. So they've given up all their connections into the material world, and they are practiced in brahmacharya or celibacy, and they are learned in the Vedas. They're also in the renounced order of life, so they're sannyasis, and they chant the Om mantra. So we can see how different it is from the practice of Hatha Yoga, which is carried out without meeting these exacting standards. But actually it requires quite an exalted, high-level personality to execute it properly. And these sages then are able to enter into Brahman, which is the transcendence and the spiritual sky. It's the opposite of the material world. And Brahman actually refers to 3 things. And one type of Brahman is the individual living entity. And the second is the impersonal Brahma Jyotir, which is the bodily effulgence of Krishna. And this is the type of Brahman that is being referred to in this verse. And the third is Para Brahman, which is Krishna himself, the Supreme Brahman. So these people who practice Ashtanga Yoga, who recite Omkara at the time of death, they realize 2 of Brahman's features, as Prabhupada said in the purport. They can either merge into the impersonal Brahma Jyotir, or they go back to Godhead, to Para Brahman, or Krishna. But the thing is, if they merge in the impersonal Brahma Jyoti, there is no activity. There's no enjoyment. There's no ananda there. There's no bliss when you merge into Brahman. So, ananda comes from, participating in the pastimes of Krishna, in building up a relationship with him, where one is surrounded by exalted devotees and, blissful and supreme devotional service. And, this is done in a mood of selflessness without any ulterior motive or, kind of one's own personal sense of pleasure, one's own personal sense of gratification. So it's, again, far removed from worshipping the demigods for our own gain. But Krishna, he desires he honors the desires of the living entity. So if they want to merge into impersonal Brahman, he will give them that opportunity. But we must remember that living entities, they can't stay in the impersonal Brahman, in Krishna's effulgence, for very long. They fall from that place because the soul is active, actually requires activities. And because there's none of that in the Brahma Jyoti, there's no ananda, there's no bliss, we have to come back down to earth to perform activities. But the difference is, if we go to the spiritual world, there is no chance of falling down into the material energy again. So, this is why we are encouraged not to attain the Brahma Jyoti. We can go to the spiritual world and remain with Krishna in our own particular ras, our personal relationship with him, and carry out eternal pastimes. So there's a few more differences between the processes of Ashtanga Yoga, and which are outlined in this verse, and Bhakti Yoga, or Krishna consciousness. And in Ashtanga Yoga, as it says, celibacy is very important, but in Krishna consciousness, married life or grahastha life is allowed. In Ashtanga Yoga, it's not allowed. And the yogic practitioner has to renounce his family relations and, just leave everything, go to the forest and practice it in a serious frame of mind without, any outside disturbances, without engaging in sense gratification and, strictly following the brahmacharya process while fixing his mind on the Lord. So it's not possible to practice sex life at the same time. Ashtanga Yoga is more restrictive than Bhakti Yoga in a lot of ways. It's a bit harder. And that is why Bhakti Yoga is the prescribed path for this age. And, chanting the Maha Mantras Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has outlined is the Yog Dharma. It's actually the prescribed activity for our present age, Kali Yuga. And for people who practice Ashtanga Yoga, primarily their goal is to merge in the impersonal Brahman, or Brahma Jyoti, but that's the lower stage of God realization. And impersonalists or Mayavadis, they don't have a personal conception of God, which allows him to be a person, just like us. But they think that the abstract impersonal form is everything. And, they try and merge into that abstract form. And Krishna allows them to do that as per their desire. And in the old days, when Vedic culture was more prevalent, people had to practice brahmacharya under a spiritual master. That was the prescribed path, and there was no choice. So the spiritual master would take into account, the nature, the varna of their disciples, whether he was a brahmana or kshatriya or vaishya, and the guru would then decide which ashram he belonged in, whether he was a grahastha or a brahmacharya. And in Bhakti Yoga, they don't have to remain a brahmachari. He can go into grahastha ashram, he can practice Krishna consciousness in a very, exalted way. He can have children, provided he knows how to bring them up, so that, that make sure that at the end of their lives they take no more births in a material body, and, because he has given them good instructions. So he can use sex life to please the Lord. But this verse is for those practicing Ashtanga Yoga rather than Bhakti Yoga. But in the modern world doesn't really allow for the practice of celibacy to all intents and purposes. And Prabhupada outlines in the purport that the social construction of the world has changed so much that there is no possibility of practicing celibacy from the beginning of life under the care of a spiritual master following proper Vedic injunctions. And these days, the vast majority of people are attached to family life, a fast-paced life, where there are opportunities to take whatever pleasures are available through sense gratification. But the scriptures prescribe brahmacharya because it accelerates the pace of advancement in spiritual life. But in Kali Yuga, which is, known as the age of quarrel and hypocrisy, brahmacharya, celibacy, is impossible to practice. And Kali Yuga is described as an ocean of faults. In this day and age, there can be fights over the smallest misunderstandings, and the propensity for mercy is said to be almost nil. And it's described in Shastra that there's always fighting and wars between men and nations. And this happens because of the unrestricted killing of so many animals and, all the karma that accrues from that. And in the 12th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 2, there are other verses outlining how people will be harassed by famine, by excessive taxes. So it's a very, very bitter age, the one that we're in now. But as has been described, there is a remedy. So in chapter 3, verse 51 of Canto 12, that verse describes that, although Kali Yuga is an ocean of faults, there is still one good quality about this age. Simply by chanting the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, one can become free from material bondage and be promoted to the transcendental kingdom. So in other ages, other yuga dharmas are prescribed. So in verse 52, it's described that, in Satyuga, people attained self-realization by meditating on Vishnu. In Treta Yuga, they performed sacrifices, and in Dwapara Yuga, they served the Lord's lotus feet, in the form of deity worship. But in Kali Yuga, our Yag Dharma is simply chanting the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. And that's why Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, chanting the holy name of the Lord is the only way to attain the Supreme in this age. And it's the easiest way. In other ages, it was very complicated, for example, to perform sacrifices in Treta Yuga. There'd be sort of so many, hundreds of thousands of gallons of ghee and, all the paraphernalia that was required in those ages that we simply wouldn't be able to perform them now. So in some ways, we've been given the easiest method of attaining self-realization. And from the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Adi Leela, chapter 17, verse 21, there's the famous verse, Hare Nama, Hare Nama, Hare Nama Eva Kevalam, Galau Nasti, Eva Nasti, Eva Nasti, Eva Gatir, Anyata. In this age of quarrel and hypocrisy, the only means of deliverance is chanting the holy name of the Lord. There is no other way, there is no other way, there is no other way. And so everyone in any caste, everyone in any creed, everyone in any social order, everyone in any gender can be liberated by taking shelter of the holy name. And so Chaitanya Mahaprabhu also said, Giba Vipra, Giba Nyasi, Sudra Kenanaya, Ye Krishna Tattva Veta, Se Guru Haya. Whether one is a Brahmana, a sannyasi, or a Sudra, regardless of what he is, he can become a spiritual master if he knows the science of Krishna. So this verse is telling us it doesn't really matter what your position is, what your condition is. If you take up Krishna consciousness, you can make inordinate amounts of spiritual progress. You can become a guru. You don't necessarily have to become a sannyasi in the Krishna consciousness, in the Krishna conscious process, which is required in the Ashtanga Yoga process. You can be a grahastha and still go back to Godhead. And of course, one of the prime examples of, an elevated grahastha is Bhaktivinoda Tagore. So he's, one of the best examples of an elevated devotee. And he was a grahastha with many children, 10 children, who's a renowned magistrate, but he was also an acharya. And he wrote volumes and volumes of books reintroducing the teachings of Lord Chaitanya at a time when the knowledge has been lost. And he also, sent books, including, Life and Precepts of Lord Chaitanya, to university libraries in foreign countries, and in order to plant the seed of Krishna consciousness in other countries. And he composed hundreds of devotional songs which really uplift the spirit and the heart. He also discovered and excavated the birthplace of Lord Chaitanya. So he's the pinnacle of Grahastha practice in Krishna consciousness. And so this is this sublime process that any one of us can take it up and reach the ultimate goal, as it has it in this chapter, remembering Krishna at the time of death and going back to Godhead. So in this verse, Krishna stresses Ashtanga Yoga and the importance of brahmacharya, so following the rules and regulations of austerity in order to reach Brahman realization. And predominantly those who prefer this method, they want to reach impersonal Brahman only, whereas devotees, they prefer to go to the highest Brahman, or Para Brahman, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and engage in pastimes with him. So that's as much as I've deciphered from this verse, and I'd like to thank you for your kind attention this evening, but do you have any questions at all? 8:11. 8:11. So the verse. So the verse is, persons who are learned in the Vedas, who utter Omkara, and who are great sages in the renounced order, enter into Brahman. Desiring such perfection, one practices celibacy. I shall now briefly explain to you this process by which one may attain salvation. So Krishna is describing the process of Ashtanga Yoga, and we were just discussing how you have to be very elevated to practice Ashtanga Yoga. And, you have to be learned in the Vedas, you have to practice celibacy, you have to chant Omkara. And actually we were saying that Bhakti Yoga is much simpler than practicing Ashtanga Yoga, because we've got the easiest method in this, the Yoga Dharma, the prescribed method. So, but Krishna has given this method for those who are attracted to it. Yes. Absolutely. So I really like the way you described the Ashtanga Yoga process. You're saying it's quite goal-orientated and you're focused on getting to the next stage, because there are 8 stages, yam, niyam, asanas, and all those stages, and you're just quite focused on getting to the next stage. And actually it's only when you get to samadhi, the 8th and last stage, that's when you can practice bhakti. So of course it takes long time to get to bhakti, whereas by chanting the Maha Mantra, this is the straightforward process. It's like taking very fast elevator rather than climbing the stairs to the 100th floor. So we can attain bhakti very easily and very simply by chanting the Maha Mantra and following the process that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has set out for us. So that's kind of what I gleaned from this verse, that we've got the best process in this dharma. Even though Kali-yuga is an ocean of faults, we've been given the best process.
I was just thinking about what you were saying at the beginning, that I remember the time of death, that's where you go next, looking really scared, because you're just going into the front world, and I just, thought, wanted into your thought, the kind of death, and then,
Yes. So you're saying I scared you a little by talking about, where we go at the time of the death, because, at the beginning of the 8th chapter, Krishna is talking about how to attain him, by remembering him at the time of death. So, and also because we don't know when we're going to die, it's really important to actually be practicing Krishna consciousness, because you can't, we were saying you can't suddenly remember Krishna at the time of death if you haven't practiced your whole life. So death is like a spiritual test for us. And if we've been practicing properly by, focusing and chanting with attention, then we will be able to remember Krishna at the time of death, which is described as quite a disturbing process. Your mind and your bodily functions are not quite there. So if you have practiced the whole life, it will be easier to hold on to Krishna when we need to. Yeah. Thank you for that, Khaled. Mm. That's so true.
To think of him, just when you're chanting, just hear, just all you have to do is just hear. You don't have to go into the philosophy why I'm chanting, and what is what will happen to me after that, or when I'm leaving. Just chant and just hear.
Yes.
And then that will be the process. It's so powerful, and then you were mentioning that Srila Prabhupada started this whole movement with chanting Hare Krishna. And then he gave a whole elaboration on how Srila Prabhupada went all over to just read the Hare Krishna mantra and the verse. So he was saying, you just read, you just chant and you listen. So time of death also, our mind is so, like he was saying, we get so used to it. And even if you're not chanting, you will be still chanting. Then you know that sometimes you know that sometimes you can be driving a car, or we could be watching this, and you don't know you start to chant, like the automatic thing.
Yes.
I see that with even devotees who have just become there, some people there, they say, oh, this morning, I was just driving and I was chanting, and I suddenly realized I was chanting.
Yes.
The person didn't know they were chanting.
Yes.
Suddenly realized, oh, I'm chanting.
Absolutely. You've made a brilliant point, about actually when you hear, when you chant, you have to just hear the name. You don't worry about philosophy or anything. You just have to hear the name and just put your full attention on Krishna. And yes, I like what you said about when you're driving, you suddenly start chanting. You don't even have your beads or anything, but you just suddenly start chanting. That happens to me when I wake up in the morning sometimes. I've got the Maha Mantra, start chanting Hare Krishna, just as I'm waking up, that stage between sleep and wakeness. So yeah, kind of that happens to me sometimes, not often, not often enough. Yes.
If we make that Prabhupada says is symbol for the symbol, is
Yes.
so easy, as you were saying.
It's a very simple process.
We have a symbol.
That's it. Yes. Absolutely. Exactly, yes. And I think because we are complicated people, we've been given a simple process. And, I talked a little bit about how in Kali Yuga, kind of there's the propensity to quarrel. And even over slight mistakes, people can, kind of really have a massive fight. And so, for us, we can't, I think, hold complicated instructions. We just don't have the, mentality to actually carry out, kind of complicated sort of rituals. So I think for us, we've been given a very, very simple process. Kind of it's simple if you kind of really, chant with your heart. And your soul, because it's not easy to keep focused, but I think if you make the endeavor, if you just make the attempt, then, I think Krishna sends the mercy. That's when you get the mercy, when he can see you're really trying. So, yes, and then we'll get tested at the end of our lives. Yes, and may we all live long in Srila Prabhupada's service. Okay, thank you so much for listening. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Grantaraj Bhagavad Gita ki jai. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming.
Yes, I'm just finished doing everything there, and I was like, what's going on?
Yes.
You come every Wednesday?
I come, yeah, sometimes, but Abby, I think because, with the wedding coming up for me, I haven't organised anything. I think after the wedding I will resume.
Shanti.